Hello, everyone. I'm in Bucharest, Romania, about 2/3 of the way through the European leg of my Beyond Order tour, which seems to be going very nicely. I've spent some time over the last few weeks, it's June 16th, 2022, by the way, writing a couple of articles for the Telegraph, one of which I'm going to read to you today, called Butchers and Liars. We are sacrificing our children on the altar of a malicious far-left ideology. The medical profession is crumbling in response to radical transgender activists. There's good evidence that many ancient societies sacrificed children to their gods. Parents in ancient Phoenician colonies in Carthage, Sicily, Sardinia, and Malta slew their offspring prior to cremating them, hoping that the gods would hear their voices and bless them. We are rightly appalled by this, though sometimes I wonder whether we understand child sacrifice far more than we'd like to admit. I saw a video the other day featuring an American surgeon bragging that he had performed more than 3,000 double mastectomies on young women who had paid for gender reassignment. Individuals confused, one might say encouraged, by those who profit from it into believing that their adolescent emotional trials can be cured and happiness reign forever if they subject themselves to this brutal practice. And it is brutal. A process that often includes not only the aforementioned mastectomies, but other appalling surgical processes. Orchiectomy, that's castration in blunter language, the removal of the uterus, the demolition of the musculature of the forearm to make what is not a penis, but must be referred to as such. All of that. For someone purporting to be a physician, to perform this on children, to me at least, seems like something worthy of a prison sentence. Whatever happened to the doctrine expressed by the ancient language as primum non nocere, first, do no harm? The Hippocratic Oath has been replaced by a delusion, a belief that can be summarized as, by blocking the puberty of children and then surgically altering them, we are only restoring what is theirs by right. A child's feelings are the final arbiters of their reproductive destiny, and any attempt to contest their gender identity risks increasing their proclivity for suicide. Lies. 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 Then, butchery. Changing standards. Psychologists, those in my own personal field of medicine, have also surrendered to this groupthink. The American Psychological Association's Task Force on Guidelines for Psychological Practice with Transgender and Gender Nonconforming People, TGNC, insists that psychologists and other professional counselors offer trans-affirmative care, starting with such niceties as displaying TGNC affirmative resources in waiting areas. Practitioners are also asked to examine how their language, e.g., use of incorrect pronouns and names, may reinforce the gender binary in overt or subtle and unintentional ways. These guidelines first read like a manual of indoctrination written by Marxist ideologues, and second, like a document designed to undermine and destroy the practice of therapy itself. But at an alarming rate, these guidelines have transformed themselves into punitive laws governing what a psychologist or counselor may say and think in relation to their clients. Let me make myself perfectly clear. Speaking as a professional, whether in America, Britain, or anywhere, it is not the place of a therapist to affirm or conversely to deny the identity of anyone whom they admit into their care. People come to see a therapist often after long and painful deliberation because they are suffering, confused, or both. The job of that therapist is to listen, to question, and to proceed with due caution, neither providing cheap advice and thereby stealing their clients' successes or heaping failure upon them, nor assuming special knowledge of the proper outcome for a given individual. There is simply no way I would ever tell a 15-year-old adolescent that she is absolutely correct if sometimes she feels more masculine than feminine, however that feeling might emerge, and that if she feels that surgery is the answer, then recommend hormones that day. I would instead spend many weeks, even perhaps many months or years, listening to her unwrap her story, using caution as my watchword, and help her to come to some thorough and well-developed understanding of both her autobiographical history and her destiny. That is not affirmation, and neither is it denial. How could I possibly dare to do either when someone has come to me because they are mixed up and desperate, a state of twinned experience indicating a profound confusion about identity itself? Radical new guidelines. I am focusing on the American Psychological Association, APA, because it is the body charged with establishing the norms and ideals for clinical practice in the most populous democracy on earth. Principles that will and are spread around the West more broadly, including in Britain. Some of their guidelines are appalling enough to deserve dissection. Guideline 1. Psychologists understand that gender is a non-binary construct that allows for a range of gender identities and that a person's gender identity may not align with sex assigned at birth. I don't understand this radical postmodern definition of gender, one that rests on a person's deeply felt or inherent sense of being one sex over another, regardless of biology. Psychologically, it is indisputably the case that a non-trivial proportion of males have a feminine temperament, which essentially means that they experience higher levels of negative emotion, such as anxiety and the analogs of pain, grief, frustration, disappointment, depression, and are more agreeable, compassionate, polite than typical males. And equally true that a non-trivial proportion of females have a masculine temperament. But this does not change how, objectively, professionals should measure a person's gender. Psychologists once cared if measurement followed standard practices of validity and reliability. Try reading, for example, a document published by the APA itself in 2014, where you will learn that a psychologist worthy of his salt is obliged to utilize constructs, i.e., terms such as gender, in a technically appropriate manner. This means, at the very least, that fundamental attributes must be measurable and measured properly. But all that goes out the window when we're discussing the magic of gender now, which is entirely subjectively defined, even though that insistence indubitably contravenes the earlier standards. But feelings über alles, folks, and it's no joke, particularly if you're 15 and have undergone surgery that makes you incapable of reproducing, often to foster someone else's sense of moral superiority or sense of self-attributed compassion, a word that increasingly makes me shudder when I encounter it. New doctrines. Psychologists are also now adopting the simple-minded and anything but revolutionary doctrine of intersectionality without question. And what is that doctrine? Nothing more than the claim that human beings are characterized by identities that span multiple dimensions. Any given person has a race, ethnicity, sex, temperament, 5 dimensions there alone, intelligence level, etc. We've known that forever. It's only became a hot cultural item since fools noted the obvious fact that minority status might be additive or multiplicative. I hate to even point out, given that anyone with any sense whatsoever also knew, without any statistical training, that it was possible to be of Latino extraction, say, or even Latin X, to use that absurd, demeaning, and patronizing term, and female simultaneously. One cannot question this, however, without fear of being ostracized by one's colleagues. Note the chilling wording of Guideline 7. Psychologists understand the need to promote social change that reduces the negative effects of stigma on the health and well-being of TGNC people. In summary, if you're not an activist and one of our activists, then you better be watching over your shoulder. So what should govern my behavior as a therapist and your expectations as a client? The answer to that is whatever the activists deem a priority at their whim. And remember that in court, folks. Active malevolence. I'm increasingly ashamed to be a clinical psychologist, given the utter cowardice, spinelessness, and apathy that characterizes many colleagues, and even more so my professional associations. At least in 20 years, when we all come to regret this terrible social experiment, I may be able to say, I said no when they all came to insist that we participate in the sacrifice of our children. Other countries, and Britain in particular, must not make the same mistakes as in the US and elsewhere. I cannot consent to what we are doing. I cannot abide by what have become the doctrines of my discipline. I believe that the acts of the medical professional rushing to disfigure, sterilize, and harm young people with what are clearly ill-advised, dangerous, and experimental procedures cross the line from do no harm to outright harm. Only if we bury our heads in the sand will sterility, impaired or absent sexual function, complex reactions to poorly understood hormones, expense, and intermingled with all of that, misery and confusion continue for countless young people. We must address the threat posed to the integrity of the entire education system, as well as indoctrination into the same philosophy that spawned this surgical enterprise and the APA guidelines grows. It threatens general public trust that our peace and prosperity depends upon. And, by the way, it will most definitely be the case that a disproportionate number of children freed from their hypothetical gender confusion would have grown up to be physically intact and fully functional gay adults. Need I point out that this unpalatable fact makes a mockery of any claim that the extended alphabet world of the LGBTQ plus coterie in any sense constitutes a homogeneous and unified community. We have crossed the line from ideological possession to active malevolence, and we are multiplying our sin. There's an intersection for you, by attributing our appalling actions to compassion. Heaven help us. Truly,